Hey guys, welcome back. We are in week 2, module 5, and in this video we are going to be discussing tinctures. Now, tinctures are one of my favorite forms of herbalism, and they are incredibly diverse and they have been used for a very long time. You can ingest them, you can put them on your skin topically. There really are so many different possibilities when it comes to tinctures. Important things to keep in mind when you're creating your own tinctures is that dependent on what you're extracting, you will need to use different liquids to extract them. Now, I just want to show you guys a couple that I've got going right now. One that I have going is some citronella tincture. I started this on the 11th of July, and if you can see, it's very green. It's very dark. Now, when this started out, it was not this dark, and that's a good indicator that it's extracting those herbal essences and constituents. When I first put the liquid into this jar, it was clear because it's vodka. So for this specific tincture, I used 80 proof vodka. And for the tinctures that we're going to be making today where we're using vodka, it's going to be 80 proof. Now, you can use a higher, stronger grade of concentrated alcohol, like a higher proof, for certain things, if you can find it. So typically, if it's something that's a dried herb or bark or flower or whatever you're extracting, if it's dried, if it's dehydrated, then 80 proof vodka will do the trick. If it's something that's fresh or kind of wet still, then you're going to want to use a higher grade, a higher proof. 100 to 120 is pretty acceptable. I got 80 proof and I was going to get a bottle of 120 proof, but I had a hard time finding it at my local liquor store. They had 80 proof and 190 proof grain alcohol, which is just a little too strong. I'm sure you could use it in some instances, but I don't feel like I would do that, mostly because a lot of times when you make a tincture, you ingest it, and you either ingest it by dropping it under your tongue, or you might mix it into tea or something else and take it that way. And I really don't want to put grain alcohol under my tongue, personally. But to each their own. You can use it, but as a general rule, if it's dried herbs and flowers, you're going to use 80 proof. If it's wet, you're going to use 120 proof. As I mentioned in the introductory video at the very beginning of this course, if you do not feel comfortable using vodka or any kind of alcohol to extract for your tinctures, that's totally fine. You can substitute for apple cider vinegar for any of the recipes that we're going to be making. So apple cider vinegar is just as capable of extracting those nutrients and those aromas, the flavors, the constituents, all those healing properties and magical properties that we're going to be drawing out with the alcohol. You can achieve that just as well with vinegar. In fact, we're going to be making 3 different tinctures, and one of those that we're going to be making is going to be, in fact, with apple cider vinegar. That way, you kind of have a working demonstration if you decide to go ahead and use that method instead. Making tinctures is super simple. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the cold emulsification process of making oils, in that you don't need a lot of supplies for it. You will need a scale to measure out your ingredients. You will need a jar to place your mixture in. You're going to need your herbs, flowers, etc., whatever you're going to be extracting. You need that itself, and then you need your extractor. So you're going to either need your apple cider vinegar or your vodka. And that's all that you need. It's not as drawn out as some of the different supply lists and ingredient lists for making oils, and it's certainly not as there's not as many steps to it as there are to some of the other things that we're going to be making a little bit later on in this course. A couple of other items that you're going to want to have on hand that's going to make this process a lot simpler is one of those funnels I was telling you about. I use the largest one in my arsenal simply because it has the largest hole and it's easier for the herbs and stuff to fall through. You can use a stick to poke them or a skewer like the one that we used when we were dressing our candles if you'd like, if it's not so ground up so fine that it can fit through there. And another thing about making tinctures, you really don't have to grind. That's another way that makes them really simple. You don't have to grind them down the way that you would when you're doing your incense blends, or even when you're doing the oils or dressing candles or any of those things. You can really just kind of break it up a little bit, just enough so that the plant releases its juices and scents and everything, and then just put it in the jar and start to mix. Another thing that I'm going to suggest you have your trusty glass measuring cup. Now for this one, I have my smaller one, and what I like to do is, I'll show you this on when we do the other video on making the next tincture. So what you're going to do, turn your scale on. When your scale turned on and you put it down, you're going to select the unit. So I want to go ahead and do pounds and ounces, because I know that this is going to be pretty heavy. You can probably just do, actually, let's just do ounces. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it on top of the scale, just like that. Now, it's reading 23.07 ounces. There should be a tare button to the right. On my scale, it's the same as the power button. So I hit tare, and what that does is it drops the scale back down to 0. Now the scale is back down to 0, and so I can adequately measure my ingredients. And that's how I implement my scale and my measuring cup. Now, we talked about the different kinds of alcohol and extractors that you're going to use for the different herbs, if they're dried, if they're wet, etc. Another thing that I want to talk to you about is what the portions and the ratios look like when you're using wet versus when you're using dry. When you're making tinctures with dry herbs and flowers, the ratio is 1 part herbs, flowers, dried ingredients to 5 parts liquid extractor. So if we're going to be doing some dried herbs, so chamomile and lavender, which is going to be the first tincture that we make, then we're going to use 1 part of those. Take that part, whatever it is, if it's a cup, if it's a half cup, whatever. Whatever it measures out to be on your scale, and you're going to times that by 5. And that's how much of the liquid you're going to put in. So when you're using your wet ingredients, it's a little bit different. You do 1 part herb, bark, root, whatever the plant ingredient is, you do that 1 part to 2 parts of liquid extractor. So if we use a cup of, let's say for instance, we use a cup of a wet ingredient, then we're going to use 2 cups of the extractor, whatever that may be. Now, typically it would be the stronger extractor, so like your 120 proof vodka. I'm actually going to use 80 proof for mine, and it'll work just the same. Might not be quite as potent, but it will do the trick. So let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to make our first tincture, which is our relaxation tincture. And all you're going to need for this is your lavender, and you're going to need your chamomile, your scale, your measuring cup, your funnel, empty jar, and your vodka and or apple cider vinegar, whatever you're using to extract. So let's go ahead and get started. Gonna go ahead and tear that out, put that back on, tear it out again. You can use measuring cups to pour these in if you want to, but I'm personally just going to kind of pour it in and watch where it goes. Tear that out. Okay, so just so you guys can see, I'm going to change the direction of the camera. So I put the lavender flowers in there, and I'm at 0.32. So now what I'm going to do is I want to put the exact amount of chamomile in here. Now, if you want to get experimental, you always can. You can put more of one herb than the other. I'm just choosing to do equal parts because it makes it simple. But as you grow in your abilities to make tinctures, you're going to tweak and come up with your own recipes and your own formulas, and you might find that lavender is too strong of an herb for the mixture that you want, and you want chamomile to be the more dominant note. That's totally up to you, but for simple purposes, I'm just going to do another 0.32 of chamomile. All right, so I've added my chamomile in now, and the number that I was looking for was 0.64, and I was able to get it to 0.63. My scale can be a little testy sometimes, but that's close enough. So 0.32 times 2 is 0.64. 0.63, close enough. Now, the easiest way is to just do your calculations with the calculator and then actually pour the vodka into the measuring cup and watch the scale until you reach your desired number. So if we're going to do 0.64 of dried herbs, then I'm going to need 5 times that for liquid. Well, let me do that math real quick. So if our weight of our dried herbs is 0.63, then we're going to times that by 5. Times that by 5, and it's 3.15. 3.15, and then add your 0.63 back in. So the total weight that you should see on your scale is 3.78. When you reach 3.78 on the scale, then that means you are proportionate. Your ratios are correct, and you are ready to bottle up that tincture. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, now just remember, steady as she goes, just slowly pour that vodka until you see 3.78. And sometimes I'll pour and I kind of take a little break and then I'll come back again. The reason I do that is because my scale tends to jump. I'm at 3.35, 3.56, 3.7, 3.77. So that's pretty dang close. Oh, remember I told you that my scale was jumpy? It said 3.77 just a moment ago, and when I took my phone down to capture this shot, jumped up to 3.81. Now, because the herbs that we used are pretty big, they were floured, pretty fluffy, one thing that happens sometimes when you use this proportion is that you end up with a lot less liquid than you do herbs. And this brings me to another topic I want to discuss, and that's the folk method. Now, the folk method is an old school method of making tinctures. And what it would do is you would just literally eyeball it. And one way to do that is you put your dried herbs in, you put them straight directly into the jar, and then you would fill it with alcohol until it covered the herbs entirely. The only downside about doing folk method is just that you will not have an adequate representation for if you want to repeat. So if you wanted to continuously make a recipe of some sort and you wanted the potency to be the same, you wanted the extract to be exactly the same, if you're not taking measurements, then you're not going to be able to guarantee that. That being said, I really don't like the consistency that this turned out. So for this specific blend, what we're going to do is we're going to transform this into the folk method. And I'm going to show you another tincture that has a total different reaction. You use the right ratio of portions, the 1:5 ratio, and the outcome is completely different. So I'll show you that one next, and I'll show you why it is that way. I'm simply just going to dump this into the jar because I want to show you how easy the folk method is. You might find that you like the folk method better, but I would suggest if you're going to use the wet herbs that you stay with the 1:2 ratio. All right, guys, so what I did is I just went ahead and transferred over these chamomile flowers and lavender flowers and a little tiny bit of vodka into the jar. Now, I want you to really look and see how it's mostly herbs. So for this specific formula, for this specific recipe, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that we forego the suggested ratio and we go ahead and do folk method. So now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour just enough to cover it. See, that's so much better. I didn't add a whole lot in, but I did add enough in there to where it's going to do a better job of extracting. If we would have just kept it at that 1 to 5, the end result may have been that we had it a little bit stronger concentrate, but it wouldn't have been very much at all because it would have just absorbed into the plants. So now you can see what that looks like. And already you can kind of see that the tincture is turning colors, right? You can see the yellow being extracted from the liquid. The vodka is not as clear as it was. Now I want to show you one that I made the same technique. I started out same as I did for this video. I started out doing the 1 to 5 ratio because it's usually what I do when working with dried herbs. And again, the herbs just outdid the vodka. Even though there was 5 times as much vodka as there were herbs and flowers, it just, you couldn't tell. All of the herbs were not soaked. I didn't feel confident in it, so I went ahead and did the folk method. This has been started for almost exactly a month now. So you can kind of see here, compare and contrast, brand new and after about a month. See how it's changing color? Now I know that may seem a little confusing because I just said, oh, when you're using dried herbs, do a 1 to 5 ratio. And then I totally flipped the script and told you, let's do the folk method. Well, here's the deal. Different herbs look different when weighed out at the exact same measurements. So if we used, for example, some sage or some rosemary, and we just used, we didn't use the stems, we just used the little pieces of the rosemary, and we weighed out 0.32 or 0.6 or whatever in ounces, it's going to look a lot different than that chamomile did. That chamomile is flowers, and it's big, it has a lot of fluffiness to it, the actual consistency of the herb itself, and it can actually absorb a lot more of the liquor. And so when you're working with plants, you're going to find that it's not always, what works for one is not always going to work for the other. And that's totally okay. So in the instance when I began making that chamomile lavender tincture and I was developing this recipe for this course, I realized that I didn't like using the 1 to 5 ratio and that the folk method was the better method to use for those herbs. Now, at the same time, I want to show you another one that was comprised of dried ingredients that I used the 1 to 5 and it came out beautifully. And you can feel free to make this one too. This is a bonus. So this is a valerian root, and you can get these whole or you can get these ground up. I get these whole. I get them from an international food mart, which I told y'all about in the beginning of this course. It's one of my favorite places to get herbs and such. So I got the root, and I wanted to make some tincture out of it because valerian is really great for calming you down, and it's also really good to help sleep. And so I thought it would be really nice to have a tincture on hand for those nights when I can't sleep that well. Just put a couple of drops in my tea and then have a night's rest. Now, I made this tincture the same day as I made that other chamomile and lavender tincture a month ago. I did the 1 to 5 ratio, and look at the difference. Now you can see that the roots are in there. I didn't have to grind them up. I just used the roots whole, just threw them in there. Measured out my roots, measured out my vodka, put it in there. And there you go. And look how dark that is. This is an instance where the 1 to 5 ratio worked great for making a tincture. This plant is a lot more compact, so this root is a lot more compact than, say, the chamomile flowers are. Even more than the lavender flowers. Lavender too, once it gets wet, you've seen this in your oil that you made, if you use lavender, it kind of starts to open up. The flower starts to open up, and so it's taking up more space, it's absorbing more liquid, and so in that instance, the folk method was the correct method to use. Now we're going to discuss another method, and this is the method that we're going to be making with dandelion root. So stay tuned for that video.